Welcome to this 365 Freedom Strategy session. Today we're breaking down the mechanics of courageous simplification and why your biggest business bottleneck is the complexity you've allowed to accumulate.
That is exactly where we need to focus our attention today,
Yeah.
because we are looking directly at the FreedomFlow methodology, specifically isolating the principles outlined in week 5.
Right.
The core thesis we're analyzing here is straightforward, but it's highly confrontational for most leaders. Strong systems actually remove friction rather than adding it. True simplification is about choosing clarity over accumulation.
And before we get into the actual mechanics of that, I think it's crucial we contextualize week 5. For you, the listener, if we're treating you as our third partner in this room, you need to see the whole board.
Absolutely.
We're talking about week 5, which obviously implies a preceding progression.
Right, there's a buildup.
Could you maybe briefly map out what the first 4 weeks of the FreedomFlow methodology entail, just so we understand exactly where courageous simplification fits into the broader operational architecture?
Sure. I mean, you can't simplify a system you don't fully understand. So in the framework, week 1 is baseline mapping.
The audit.
Exactly. It's essentially conducting a ruthless audit of where your time, capital, and energy are actually going rather than where you think they're going.
Which is usually a massive wake-up call.
Huge. Then week 2 is value identification. That forces you to isolate the specific actions that generate actual revenue or client success. Week 3 is constraint analysis, where we locate the bottlenecks.
Finding the exact points of drag.
Yes. And week 4 focuses on systemic alignment, ensuring your team's daily actions actually reflect the core value you identified back in week 2.
Okay, so by the time you reach week 5...
Courageous simplification.
Right. By the time you get there, you aren't guessing anymore.
Not at all. You have a clear map of your business, which means you're finally in a position to start dismantling the obsolete infrastructure that is slowing you down.
That makes perfect sense. So week 5 is the execution phase of removal, and really, that's the mission of our session with you today.
Precisely.
Look, if you're listening to this right now, and your daily operations feel crowded, or if your organizational workflows feel heavy.
Or if your team is moving slower despite having more resources and headcount.
Yeah, if you're experiencing that, you are dealing with systemic friction. So today, we're mapping out exactly how to restore operational flow to your business.
We're going to audit the very architecture of your daily routines.
Let's start with section 1, the illusion of complexity as strength. We need to dismantle a very widespread, very dangerous assumption in the business world right now.
It's arguably the most pervasive psychological trap that founders, executives, and leaders fall into.
We naturally gravitate toward complexity.
We do, because we falsely believe that adding layers, adding appliance checks, and adding administrative steps somehow creates a robust safety net against mistakes.
We equate a dense bureaucratic process with operational maturity.
Exactly. We think heavy means safe.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I know exactly what our listener is thinking right now.
Go ahead.
Let's say I run a logistics firm
All right.
or a mid-market marketing agency, and we drop the ball.
A failure happens.
Right. A $50,000 client deliverable goes out with a critical error, or a supply chain deadline is completely missed. As a responsible leader, my immediate reaction is to ensure that specific failure never happens again.
Naturally.
So I mandate a secondary review process. I require a new approval signature from a department head before deployment.
And you think you fixed it.
Isn't that just responsible risk management? At what point does responsible risk mitigation cross the line into toxic complexity?
That is the exact friction point every scaling business hits. To answer your question, responsible risk management is introducing a control that directly prevents the specific failure without degrading the overall velocity of the system.
Okay.
Toxic complexity is when you introduce a control that merely spreads the accountability around, so no single person can be blamed next time.
Ah, that's a huge distinction.
It is. When you mandate a new approval signature from a department head, you aren't necessarily improving the quality of the work. You're often just creating a bottleneck.
Because the department head is busy.
Right. They become a rubber stamp because they don't have the time to deeply review the deliverable anyway.
They're just signing off to clear their desk.
Exactly. So now a project that used to take 2 days takes 5. The client is frustrated by the slower turnaround, and the original error could still slip through.
Because nobody actually checked the work.
Yes. You haven't solved the root problem. Maybe it was inadequate initial training, or maybe unclear project scoping. You've just added operational armor.
And armor is incredibly heavy.
It exhausts the person wearing it.
It's a defensive posture. You're building a wall, but you're doing it inside your own house. And now you have to walk around that wall every single day just to get to the kitchen.
That's a great way to put it.
And the quote from the FreedomFlow framework we really need to analyze here is this: simplification is choosing clarity over accumulation.
Clarity over accumulation.
I want to break down that word, accumulation.
Yeah.
Why is business growth almost always incorrectly equated with the accumulation of processes?
It goes back to a phenomenon we can call enterprise emulation.
Enterprise emulation. Unpack that.
When you start a business, you're lean, you're agile, and you have virtually zero infrastructure.
You're just moving fast and breaking things.
Right. But as you scale, you look at Fortune 500 companies, the industry giants, and you see vast, complex infrastructures.
You see multi-tiered approval matrices.
Complex procurement protocols, massive compliance departments. So you assume that to become a big company, you need to replicate a vast, complex infrastructure.
You start hoarding processes.
Yes. You hoard them to feel like a real enterprise. But you're missing the context. Those enterprise companies don't operate efficiently because of that complexity.
They operate in spite of it.
Exactly. They operate in spite of it, relying on massive capital reserves to absorb the friction.
Which a scaling business simply does not have.
No, it's a fundamental misinterpretation of scale.
Accumulation feels like progress because it's tangible. Procuring a new piece of enterprise software, establishing a new 7-step standard operating procedure.
Or creating a new cross-departmental committee.
Right, feels like you're maturing the business. But it's actually the sunk cost fallacy in action.
How so?
Well, you invest so much time building out these elaborate protocols that you feel compelled to use them even when they actively hinder your output.
Yes, you force the team to use the tool because you paid for the tool.
Exactly. You're accumulating steps to feel prepared for every possible edge case. But eventually, the core function of the business grinds to a halt.
Because everyone is entirely focused on navigating the process rather than delivering the result.
The process becomes the job.
And this complexity grows quietly. It's almost completely invisible while it's happening. We often refer to this as process debt.
Like technical debt in software engineering.
Functions exactly the same way. One small, seemingly logical step is added here. A mandatory daily reporting metric is added there.
And suddenly, a client onboarding workflow that used to take 20 minutes and one phone call
now takes 3 days, requires data entry across 4 different software platforms, and triggers automated emails that no one actually reads.
It's maddening.
Routines that made absolute sense during an earlier phase of your business expansion linger out of pure habit.
They're ghosts in the machine.
They no longer contribute to the final strategic goal, but they remain part of the system simply because they've always been there.
And no one has had the authority or the courage to question them.
Or they're just too busy running the heavy system to stop and audit it.
Think about the massive financial and cognitive cost of this process debt. If we look at cognitive load theory, forcing an employee to constantly switch contexts,
moving from your CRM to a project management tool,
to an internal messaging channel, just to verify one piece of data, it destroys their ability to perform deep, focused work.
It takes an average of 23 minutes to fully regain focus after a distraction or a context switch.
23 minutes. So if your accumulated processes force your team to jump through bureaucratic hoops 5 times a day, you aren't just losing the 10 minutes it takes to fill out the form.
You're losing hours of high-level cognitive output.
You're draining your team's bandwidth on navigation rather than execution.
Which creates immense systemic friction. And friction destroys momentum.
It kills it completely.
This brings us perfectly to the second section of our agenda today. Analyzing the heavy workflow microstory provided in the 365 Freedom Framework.
Yes, this is such a brilliant, highly specific case study of this exact phenomenon in action.
We really need to dissect the psychological mechanics behind it.
It's the case study of the client who layered so many steps into her daily workflow that even simple tasks felt unbearably heavy.
We need to analyze her situation closely because if you're listening to this, her operational reality likely mirrors what you're doing in your own company right now.
Let's look at the root cause of her self-sabotage. The text explicitly states she believed complexity kept her safe from mistakes.
Yes.
But what's the deeper psychology there? Why do we hold on to that belief so tightly even when we're drowning in the work?
The secondary underlying fear for this client, and really for most founders, is that removing any of those accumulated steps would break the structure entirely.
Like pulling a thread on a sweater.
Exactly. She had built this elaborate operational architecture over years, and she viewed it as a fragile house of cards, or perhaps a Jenga tower.
A Jenga tower is a perfect analogy.
Her assumption was that every single process, no matter how redundant, was a load-bearing column. If she pulled out one piece,
Even a completely useless weekly reporting matrix.
right, even that, she was terrified the whole operational model would collapse. It's a lack of trust in the core competency of the business,
You start believing the process is the product.
rather than realizing the process is just the delivery mechanism for the product.
That fear of dismantling what you've built is profound, and it's intrinsically tied to ego.
Very personal for leaders.
You invest capital, late nights, and significant intellectual bandwidth into designing a system. You champion the integration of that expensive software platform.
You wrote the 50-page employee handbook.
You defended these systems in board meetings, admitting that parts of that system are now obsolete, or worse, actively harming your company's productivity.
It requires you to put your executive ego aside.
Totally. You have to look at your own creation objectively and say, this is no longer serving our strategic objectives.
It's painful.
So instead of engaging in that uncomfortable self-reflection, this client just kept operating within the heavy structure. She just endured the consequences.
And we cannot ignore the specific words the 365 Freedom text uses to describe those consequences.
Physical toll.
Yes. The framework notes her days were feeling tighter. Her tasks were feeling dense, and her mind lacked calm.
Those aren't just colorful adjectives.
No, they describe a somatic, physiological response to bad systems. It's not merely a business problem, it's a biological reality.
When your workflows are bloated, your nervous system actually reacts to the constant friction.
You experience a sustained, low-grade stress because your brain knows it's burning unnecessary cognitive fuel just to maintain the status quo.
You're pushing a boulder uphill, not to reach the summit, but just to keep it from rolling backward and crushing you.
Decision fatigue sets in rapidly under those conditions. Every small choice feels monumental because the system is so dense.
The turning point in the microstory is fascinating because of its scale.
It wasn't a massive corporate restructuring.
She didn't burn the system down. She didn't hire a consulting firm for a 6-month operational overhaul.
One afternoon, she removed just one small, unnecessary step from a routine she repeated often.
One step.
And the text notes that the shift completely surprised her. Why was the result so shocking to her?
Well, it surprised her because her foundational assumption was that fewer steps meant less safety and less control.
She fully expected a breakdown.
She expected to feel exposed, or for a critical error to immediately slip through the cracks. She was bracing for impact.
Instead, she experienced a massive breakthrough.
Her work felt lighter, her mind felt calmer.
By removing one point of friction, she altered the entire physics of her workday.
She didn't lose control, she actually gained visibility because the noise was reduced.
We need to connect that emotional relief, the lighter work, the calmer mind, directly to the mechanics of her workflow.
Right, the relief wasn't some abstract spiritual awakening.
It was the mathematical result of eliminating systemic drag.
By dropping that one step, she reclaimed perhaps 15 minutes a day.
That's over an hour a week.
But more importantly, she reclaimed the mental bandwidth required to initiate and track that step. She proved to herself, in real time, that simplicity was not a downgrade or a compromise in quality.
That is the critical realization every business leader must internalize. Simplicity is not a downgrade.
It's not a limitation.
It is a return to flow. The text states, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is release what no longer supports you.
And this leads us to the most vital technical distinction we need to make in this session. We are transitioning to Section 3.
We must clearly define the boundary between sloppy execution and intentional system refinement.
We need to establish the precise technical difference between merely cutting corners and executing targeted, precise simplification.
This is where scaling businesses get into serious trouble, and I really want to push on this concept.
When executive or middle managers feel overwhelmed by the density of their work, they sometimes just start slashing things out of sheer exhaustion.
They stop conducting quarterly performance reviews.
They stop tracking client acquisition costs.
They bypass foundational quality assurance steps because they simply don't have the energy to complete them.
They might call it optimizing or going lean, but that's just cutting corners, isn't it?
Precisely. Cutting corners is a reckless, reactive removal of necessary foundational elements.
Usually born out of laziness, fatigue, or panic.
It's not strategic. It is a symptom of burnout.
When you cut corners, you are deliberately introducing severe risk into your business.
You're weakening the structural integrity of your product or service just to save a few minutes of immediate discomfort.
It's a temporary artificial relief that almost guarantees a long-term disaster.
To use a construction analogy, cutting corners is taking a sledgehammer to a load-bearing wall because you want a more open floor plan without ever checking the architectural blueprints.
You'll get your open space for a minute right before the roof collapses.
Exactly.
But precise simplification, targeted simplification, is the exact opposite of that reckless behavior.
It is highly analytical and deeply calculated.
It's the intentional, courageous removal of friction based on data and observation. It requires a profound understanding of your own workflows.
You aren't swinging a sledgehammer blindly. You're acting as the master architect.
You're studying the blueprints, identifying the partition walls that are purely cosmetic.
The processes that are actually blocking the flow of information.
And you're methodically dismantling them while preserving the integrity of the core structure.
Targeted simplification is a return to what actually drives value. It involves isolating the core objective of a process and aggressively stripping away the bureaucratic residue that has built up around it over the years.
This requires immense courage because, as we discussed earlier, it forces you to trust your core competencies again.
You have to stop hiding behind a wall of administrative checklists.
When you engage in this kind of precise refinement, you aren't losing structural integrity, you're eliminating the dead weight that's straining the structure.
Exactly. You're gaining velocity. And this speaks to the physics of flow that we see highlighted in the FreedomFlow framework.
The text explicitly states, flow follows clarity. Let's analyze why a system fundamentally needs space to breathe to function efficiently.
Think about the flow of data through an API integration.
Good example.
If you configure an integration to pull a massive payload of redundant data every 5 seconds, when you only actually need to sync 3 specific fields once an hour,
You're going to hit rate limits.
the system will crash, not because the software is weak, but because you suffocated it with unnecessary processing requirements.
That's a perfect technical parallel. Your human operational ecosystem is no different.
When you release what no longer supports the end goal, you clear out the exhaust. You create space for oxygen.
The tasks that actually move the needle on revenue or client satisfaction can be executed with speed and precision.
Because they are no longer bottlenecked by obsolete legacy steps. Flow is essentially the absence of resistance.
You cannot achieve flow by pushing your team harder against a complex, broken system.
You achieve flow by systematically removing the complexity so that forward movement becomes the path of least resistance.
Which brings us to the most important part of this session, Section 4.
Implementing the framework through a strategic audit.
We need to translate this high-level philosophy into immediate, tangible action for you, the listener. We're acting as your internal strategic partners right now, and we're going to guide you through an immediate audit of your own organizational systems.
Theory is useless without execution.
The very first instruction from the Courageous Simplification framework is to look honestly at your routines.
The operative word we must focus on there is honestly.
Why is objective honesty so incredibly difficult in this specific context?
Because ego violently defends the complexity we built.
You're the one who designed the workflow.
You're the one who signed the contract for the redundant software platform.
You're the one who instituted the mandatory Monday morning pipeline review that takes 2 hours and yields 0 actionable insights.
To look honestly at your routines means you have to be willing to admit that a strategic decision you made 2 years ago is now the exact thing slowing your company down.
You have to ruthlessly separate your identity from your operational processes. A process is just a tool. It's a means to an end.
If a manufacturer has a broken piece of machinery on the assembly line, they don't get emotionally defensive about the machine.
They swap it out so production can continue.
But in knowledge work and corporate leadership, we get deeply emotionally attached to our workflows. We treat them like our children rather than our tools.
So we're asking you right now to step back, detach your ego, and look at your operations purely as a mechanism.
Let's execute this audit right now. We want you to identify one routine that you repeat frequently.
Don't choose a massive, multi-departmental quarterly initiative or an annual compliance audit.
Choose something small, something that happens daily or weekly.
Maybe it's your client onboarding sequence.
Maybe it's your internal approval process for marketing copy.
Maybe it's how you triage your email or how your finance team processes vendor invoices.
Isolate that specific routine in your mind right now.
Now, as your strategic partners, we're going to ask you 3 critical questions derived directly from the 365 Freedom text. Apply these questions strictly to the routine you just selected.
First, where has friction grown?
Look for the physical or digital places where things stall out. Where do you find yourself sighing before you click a button?
Where does a project sit in pending status for 3 days, waiting for a redundant sign-off?
Where does the operational momentum suddenly just die?
The second strategic question, where is effort being repeated?
Are your account managers entering the exact same client data into a CRM and then manually transferring it into a separate project management tool?
Are you holding a 30-minute meeting to verbally discuss a standardized report that already contains all the necessary information and was emailed to everyone yesterday?
Redundancy is the most common and most expensive form of invisible complexity.
And the third question, which old steps are lingering purely out of habit? Look for the vestigial organs of your business.
Are you still generating a weekly predictive spreadsheet that no one on the executive team has actually opened in 6 months?
Are you acquiring a specific legal disclaimer on a document that hasn't been relevant since a regulatory change 3 years ago?
Find the steps that exist only because that's the way we've always done it.
Once you've identified these points of friction, we arrive at the actionable takeaway. The framework issues a very specific, deliberately low-barrier challenge.
The 5-minute mandate.
Give yourself exactly 5 minutes today to notice where complexity is weighing you down.
We aren't asking you to schedule a 3-day executive offsite to redesign your corporate infrastructure from the ground up.
That would just be generating more complexity. We're asking for 5 minutes of acute, honest, objective observation.
And the micro-action that must follow that observation is critical. Release one unnecessary step today. Just one.
Do not attempt to overhaul the entire system. Do not try to optimize everything at once.
Find one single, lingering, obsolete step that causes friction and eliminate it entirely.
Cancel the redundant meeting.
Delete the unused mandatory field in your CRM.
Remove the secondary approval requirement for low-risk tasks.
Just as the client in the microstory did. Emphasize to yourself and to your team that flow begins with that single point of release.
When you execute that targeted simplification, you will immediately feel the space return to the system. You will feel the workflow breathe again.
You're actively testing the hypothesis that simplicity restores space, restores clarity, and restores operational flow.
You'll prove to your own nervous system and to your organizational culture that the structure won't collapse just because you stop doing unnecessary work.
You'll realize that you're actually strengthening the system by making it significantly more aerodynamic.
It's a profound, permanent shift in operational strategy.
You're moving your entire organization from a mindset of defensive accumulation to a mindset of precise, targeted refinement. You are choosing the speed of clarity over the illusion of safety.
Before we officially close this strategy session, I want to leave you with a final paradigm shift to seriously consider as you evaluate the trajectory of your company right now.
Listen closely to this.
What if the biggest threat to your business isn't a lack of external resources? It isn't an aggressive competitor, and it isn't a shifting macroeconomic climate? What if the absolute greatest danger is the invisible friction hiding inside the very systems you built to protect yourself? Your next level of growth does not require adding more tools, more software, more steps, or more operational armor. It requires the immense leadership courage to look at your daily operations and finally let go of what is merely weighing you down.
If you're ready to bring more ease and clarity into your systems, visit 365 Freedom Online to join the community. This has been a 365 Freedom Strategy session.